Jawaharlal Nehru, Chapter 2, Kamala. On September 4th, 1935, I was suddenly released from the mountain jail to Almora, for news had come that my wife was in a critical condition. She was far away in a sanatorium at Badenweiler in the Black Forest of Germany. I hurried by automobile and train to Allahabad. Reaching there the next day and the same afternoon, I started on the air journey to Europe. The airliner took me to Karachi and Baghdad and Cairo, and from Alexandria in a seaplane carried me to Brindisi. From Brindisi, I went by train to Basel in Switzerland. I reached Badenweiler on the evening of September 9th, 4 days after I had left Allahabad and 5 days after my release from Almora jail. There was the same old brave smile on Kamala's face when I saw her, but she was too weak and too much in the grip of pain to say much. Perhaps my arrival made a difference, for she was a little better the next day and for some days after. But the crisis continued and slowly drained the life out of her, unable to accustom myself to the thought of her death. I imagined that she was improving and that if she could only survive that crisis, she might get well. The doctors, as is their way, give me hope. The immediate crisis seemed to pass and she held her ground. She was never well enough for a long conversation. We talked briefly and I would stop as soon as I noticed that she was getting tired. Sometimes I read to her. One of the books I remember reading out to her in this way was Pearl Burke's The Good Earth. She liked my doing this, but our progress was slow. Morning and afternoon, I tugged from my posture in the little town to the sanatorium and spent a few hours with her. I was full of the many things I wanted to tell her, and yet I had to restrain myself. Sometimes we talked a little of old times, old memories of common friends in India. Sometimes a little wistfully of the future and what we would do then. In spite of her serious condition, she clung to the future. Her eyes were bright and vital, her face usually cheerful. Odd friends who came to visit her were pleasantly surprised to find her looking better than they had imagined. They were amazed by those bright eyes and that smiling face. In the long autumn evenings, I sat by myself in the pension where I was staying, or sometimes went out for a walk across the fields or through the forest. 100 pictures of Kamala succeeded each other in my mind, 100 aspects of her rich and deep personality. We had been married for nearly 20 years, and yet how many times she had surprised me by something new in her mental or spiritual makeup. I had known her in so many ways, and in later years I had tried my utmost to understand her. That understanding had not been denied to me, but I often wondered if I really knew her or understood her. There was something elusive about her, something fey-like real but unsubstantial, difficult to grasp. Sometimes, looking into her eyes, I would find a stranger peeping out at me. Except for a little schooling, she had no formal education. Her mind had not gone through the educational process. She came to us as an unsophisticated girl, apparently with hardly any of the complexes which are said to be so common now. She never entirely lost that girlish look, but as she grew into a woman, her eyes acquired a depth and a fire, giving the impression of steel pools behind which storms raged. She was not the type of modern girl with a modern girl's habit and lack of poise, yet she took girl she took girl and more particularly a Kashmiri girl, sensitive and proud, childlike and grown up, foolish and wise. She was reserved to those she did not know or did not like, but bubbling over the gaiety and frankness before those she knew and liked. She was quick in her judgment and not always fair or right, but she stuck to her instinctive likes and dislikes. There was no guile in her. If she disliked a person, it was obvious, and if she made no attempt to hide the fact. Even if she had tried to do so, she would probably not have succeeded. I have come across few persons who have produced such an impression of sincerity upon me as she did. Our marriage and after. I thought of the early years of our marriage when, with all my tremendous liking for Kamala, I almost forgot her and denied her in so many ways. That comradeship which was her due. For I was like a person possessed, giving myself utterly to the cause I had espoused, living in a dream world of my own and looking at the real people who surrounded me as unsubstantial shadows. I worked to the utmost of my capacity, and my mind was filled to the brim with the subject that engrossed me. I gave all my energy to that cause and had little left to spare. And yet, I was very far from forgetting her. I came back to her again and again as to a sure haven. If I was away for a number of days, the thought of her cooled my mind, and I looked forward eagerly to my return home. What indeed could I have done if she had not been there to comfort me and give me strength, and thus enable me to recharge the exhausted battery of my mind and body? I had taken from her what she gave me. What had I given to her in exchange during these early years? I had failed evidently, and possibly she carried the deep impress of those days upon her. With her inordinate pride and sensitiveness, she did not want to come to me to ask for help, although I could have given her that help more than anyone else. She wanted to play her one part in the national struggle and not be merely a hanger-on and a shadow of her husband. She wanted to justify herself to her own self as well as to the world. Nothing in the world could have pleased me more than this, but I was far too busy to second beneath the surface, and I was blind to what she looked for and so ardently desired. And then prison claimed me so often as I was away from her, or else she was ill. Like Chitra in Tagore play, she seemed to say to me, I am Chitra, not goddess to worshipped, no goddess to worshipped, nor yet the object of common pity to be brushed aside like a moth with indifference. If you deign to keep me by your side in the path of danger and daring, if you allow me to share the great duties of your life, then you will know my true self. But she did not say this to me in words, and it was only gradually that I read the message of her eyes. In the early months of 1930, I sensed her desire and we worked together, and I found in this experience a new delight. We lived for a while on the edge of life, as it were, where the clouds were gathering and a national upheaval was coming. Those were pleasant months for us, but they ended too soon and early in April. The country was in grip of civil disobedience and governmental repression, and I was in prison again. Most of us menfolk were in prison. And then a remarkable thing happened. our women came to the front and took charge of the struggle. Women had always been there, of course, but now there was an avalanche of them which took not only the British government but their own menfolk by surprise. Here were those women, women of the upper and middle classes, leading sheltered lives in their homes, peasant women, working class women, rich women pouring out in their tens of thousands in defiance of government order and police lathi. It was not only that display of courage and daring, but what was even more surprising was the organizational power they showed. Never can I forget the thrill that came to us in Naini prison. When news of this reached us, the enormous pride in the women of India that filled us, we could hardly talk about all this among ourselves, for our hearts were full and our eyes were dim with tears. My father had joined us later in Naini prison, and he told us much that we did not know. He had been functioning outside as the leader of the civil disobedience movement. He had encouraged in no way these aggressive activities of the women all over the country. He disliked, in his paternal and somewhat old-fashioned way, young women and messing about in the streets under the hot sun of summer and coming into conflict with the police. But he realized the temper of the people and did not discourage anyone, not even his wife and daughters and daughter-in-law. He told us how he had been agreeably surprised to see the energy, courage, and ability displayed by women all over the country. Of the girls of his own household, he spoke with affectionate pride. At father's instance, a resolution of remembrance was passed at thousands of public meetings all over India on January 26, 1931. The anniversary of India's Independence Day. These meetings were banned by the police and many of them were forcefully broken up. Father had organized this from his sick bed, and it was a trump of organized, for we could not use the newspapers or the mails or the telegram or the telephone or any of the established printing presses, and yet a fixed time on an identical day all over this vast country. Even in remote villages, the resolution was read out in the language of the province and adopted. 10 days after the resolution was adopted, father died. The resolution was a long one, but a part of it related to the women of India. We record our homage and deep admiration for the womanhood of India, who in the hour of peril for the motherland forsook the shelter of their homes and with unfailing courage and endurance stood soldier to soldier with menfolk in the front line of India's national army to share with them the sacrifices and triumphs of the struggle. In the upheaval, Kamala had played a brave and notable part, and on her inexperienced shoulder fell the task of organizing our work in the city of Allahabad when every known worker was in prison. She made up for that inexperience by her fire and energy, and within a few months she became the pride of Allahabad. We met again under the shadow of my father's last illness and his death. We met on a new footing of comradeship and understanding. A few months later, when we went with our daughter to Ceylon for our first brief holiday and our last, we seemed to have discovered each other anew. All the past years that we had passed together had been put a preparation for the new and more intimate relationship. We came back all too soon, and work claimed me, and later prison. There was to be no more holidaying, no working together, not even being together, except for a brief while between two long prison terms of 2 years, each which followed each other. Before the second of these was over, Kamala lay dying, while I was arrested arrested in February 1934 on a Calcutta warrant, Kamala went up to our rooms to collect some clothes for me. I followed her to say goodbye to her. Suddenly, she clung to me and fainting collapsed. This was unusual for her, as we had trained ourselves to take this jail going lightly and cheerfully and to make as little fuss about it as possible. Was it some premonition she had that she was our last more or less normal meeting? 2 long prison terms of 2 years each had come between me and her just when our need for each other was greatest, just when we had come so near to each other. I thought of this during the long days in jail, and yet I hoped that the time would surely come when we would be together again. How did she fare during these days? I can guess, but even I do not know, for during jail interviews or during a brief interval outside there was little normality. We had to be always on our best behavior, lest we might cause pain to the other by showing our own distress. But it was obvious that she was greatly troubled and distressed over many things, and there was no peace in her mind. I might have been of some help, but not from jail. The problem of human relationships. All these and many other thoughts came to my mind during my long solitary hours in Badenweiler. I did not set the atmosphere of jail easily. I had long got used to it, and the new environment did not make any great change. I was living in the Nazi domain with all its strange happening, which I disliked so much, but Nazism did not interfere with me. There was few evidences of it in that quiet village in a corner of the Black Forest. Or perhaps my mind was full of other matters. My past life unrolled itself before me, and there was always Kamala standing by. She became a symbol of Indian women or of women herself. Sometimes she grew curiously mixed up with my ideas of India, that land of ours so dear to us, with all her faults and weaknesses, so elusive and so full of mystery. What was Kamala? Did I know her? Understand her real self? Did she know or understand me? For I too was an abnormal person with mystery and unplumbed depth within me, which I could not myself fathom. Sometimes I had thought that she was a little frightened of me because of this. I had been and was a most unsatisfactory person to marry. Kamala and I were unlike each other in some ways, and yet in some other ways very alike. We did not complement each other. Our very strength became a weakness in our relations to each other. There could either be complete understanding, a perfect union of minds, or difficulties. Neither of us could live a humdrum domestic life, accepting things as they were. Among the many pictures that were displayed in the bazaars in India, there was one containing 2 separate pictures of Kamala and me, side by side, with the inscription at the top, Adarsh Jodi, the model or ideal couple, as so many people imagined us to be. But the ideal is terribly difficult to grasp or to hold. Yet I remember telling Kamala during our holiday in Ceylon how fortunate we had been, in spite of difficulties and differences, in spite of all the tricks life had played upon us, that marriage was an odd affair, and it had not ceased to be so even after thousands of years of experience. We saw around us the wrecks of many a marriage, or what was no better, the conversation of what was bright and golden into drush. How fortunate we were, I told her, and she agreed. For though we had sometimes quarrelled and grown angry with each other, we kept that vital spark alight, and for each one of us, life was always unfolding new adventure and giving fresh insight into each other. The problem of human relationships, how fundamental it is, and how often ignored in our fierce arguments about politics and economics. It was not so ignored in the old and wise civilizations of India and China, where they developed pattern of social behavior which, with all their faults, certainly gave poise to the individual. The poise is not in evidence in India today, but where is it in the countries of the West which have progressed so much in other directions? Or is poise essentially static and opposed to progressive change? Must we sacrifice one for the other? Surely it should be possible to have a union of poise and inner and outer progress, of the wisdom of the old with the science and the vigor of the new. Indeed, we appear to have arrived at a stage in the world history when the only alternative to such a union is likely to be the destruction and undoing of both.